actually, and this is again a controversial story. Part of the reason that retailers like fair trade is because they can charge their customers high prices for it. So when you go into Tesco and you want to buy Cafe Direct coffee, it's going to be 5 or 10p more expensive than Nescafe. And most customers accept that. They say, oh, well, fair trade, it's about, because it's about giving more money to the producer, then that explains why it's 10 pence per jar more expensive. How much more expensive do you think it is to Tesco or to Sainsbury's to buy Cafe Direct as opposed to a jar of Nestle? So for the buyer in the supermarket who's gone to buy the fair trade coffee, how much more expensive do you think the jar is to them before they put it on the shelf? What's the difference between, say, Nescafe and Cafe Direct?
It would be a few pence.
Not even that. It's less than half a p. It's about 0.5 of a penny is the difference between the two to the buyer, and yet they sell it to you for 10p more expensive. It's good business, isn't it? Now nobody really wants to talk about that because nobody wants to rock the boat. So the fair trade people don't want to squeal about that because Tesco are going to turn around and say, well, if you're going to be nasty about it, then off you go. So, but for customers, the frank truth is customers are getting ripped off by buying fair trade, and that's nothing to do with the fair traders. It's to do with the supermarkets. It's to do with the big retailers. But that's business, right? So we can complain about that or not. So it's appealing to supermarkets because they can make money. The people who buy fair trade typically are the kind of customers they like. They're what are called ABs, so they're highly educated. They're often women. They're 35 to 40, so 30 to 45. So they typically have got a decent career, good income. They have lots of loyalty, and fair trade can kind of capture some young radical student people too. So it's all upside, right? There's a strategic value, because if you kind of have fair trade on your shelves, that makes you look kind of fashionable, makes you look sort of ethical, it's a bit of an ethical halo to your store for having it, and it builds consumer trust. So it's all upside for the supermarkets. And one of the kind of controversial questions is, have fair trade organisations kind of sold themselves a bit short here? I mean, their desperation to get fair trade into places like Tesco, did they really strike a good bargain? Because when you think about it, Tesco have lots of upside by stocking fair trade. And how good a bargain did they really strike? And that's a big question. Okay, so just finally on this little section, I just want to, before I round it up, just remind us there was that other labelling set of organisations that we mentioned. So there's the flow label, the label we see on coffee, that's one set of stuff, that's very much around enterprise. But then there was the World Fair Trade Organisation label, that's the stuff that goes on clothing, for example. Very different. This doesn't push towards kind of commercialisation so much, it's to do with sort of principles and values, much more like a social movement in the way it organises itself. And it typically covers these non-commodity products, and it doesn't have such a sort of rigorous auditing system or such clear standards. It has kind of principles. And we don't have to go through them all, but here's kind of, they have 10 principles. So whereas for the fair trade labelling organisations, the famous mark, very nailed down standards. $1.25 per kilo, per pound, 10% premium. Clear standards. You either pass them or you don't. For the WFTO stuff, it's more about, well, you need to show that you're creating opportunities for economically disadvantaged producers. So you kind of have to prove that, but in a pretty kind of wishy-washy way, if you will. So it's less rigorous in its standards. That's not to say we shouldn't trust it. It's not to say it doesn't mean that the organisations in this group are doing good, but it's a different kind of model. It's more about their values. And this gives you, this is their statement of what a fair price is, and I won't go through it all, but look at how WFTO talks about a fair price. It's not $1.25. It's not a number. It's about dialogue and participation, socially acceptable remuneration. Look at this here. We haven't seen this before. Equal pay for men and women. That's the first time we've heard that in anything we've talked about fair trade. That's important to these organisations. So it has a kind of different sort of value set. It's more about political change, maybe a bit less about a kind of number. But it kind of keeps the flame going, if you like, the kind of social movement side. So is fair trade a social movement? Well, in some senses it is. Certainly, its biggest single contribution maybe is it's made consumption a political choice. It said to people, when you go to do your shopping on a Thursday morning, you're not just buying stuff for you and your family. You can make a series of political choices. You can say, I believe in development for the poor, and I'm going to buy a product that does that. And this politicisation of consumption is a very important and controversial space, and Fairtrade's been in the vanguard of creating that. So it's kind of in and out of the market. It wants to play in the mainstream markets, it wants to work with Tesco, but it also wants to be criticising what people like Primark and Gap and Tesco are doing. So it's trying to sit kind of with, sup with the devil, but also criticise the devil, if you like. And part of that is this boundary blurring that we began with the triangle. Is it for profit, not for profit? Is it informal, formal? Is it private, public? Fairtrade's trying to play across these different boundaries to some degree. Does other things too. So it's a complex model. So if we go back, just to conclude then, if we go back to that little table I showed you early on, you remember that I put up the definition of fair trade that's used by kind of all these organisations, and we pulled it apart to say, well, what is this telling us? And it tells us that fair trade is about process, economic development and political campaigning, okay? This actually comes from a piece of work we did where we then went and interviewed a lot of managers in fair trade organisations. And we talked to them about what is it you're doing, why are you in fair trade, what's the objective of your organisation. And we collected a bunch of data. What do you think happened when we looked at what they were telling us and we mapped it against these three clusters? Which of these three clusters do you think was the most important or the least important when we talked to managers actually doing fair trade business right now? Which was the most important or least important?
Within economic.
Yeah. So the first clearly interest of them was the economic, was building these social enterprises. What was the second most important? Yeah, they were quite good at saying, yeah, we're really concerned about our producers, we're interested in getting this stuff going. Not one of them mentioned anything to do with this. Not a single interview yielded any conversation about campaigning, trade justice, social justice. So what this tells me is that, at least from our sample, all that stuff that fair trade talks about in terms of changing the world is getting forgotten in the day-to-day business of running the fair trade organisations. And so, does that lead us to believe that balancing these two sides, if you remember where we began with all this, we were saying that social entrepreneurship can be divided up into kind of social enterprises over here making money and changing business practices, and campaigners over here doing political change. Maybe fair trade is interesting because it seems to have both, but then when we talk to them, all that campaigning stuff seems to be disappearing. So the question is it inevitable, if you want to go mainstream, you give up all that campaigning stuff? And if that is inevitable, what are the implications of that? So when you look at Nescafe with a fair trade mark, when you look at Tesco's Roses with a fair trade mark, is that great because that's going into the mainstream, or is that what people call fair washing? You might have heard of the phrase greenwashing, companies that make themselves look green by doing a little bit of green stuff. Is this company making themselves look fair by doing a tiny little bit of this stuff? And how about political capture? Old slide, I'm afraid. The former great dear leader. You can remember that long ago when he used to be Prime Minister. But all these assembled great and the good. Penny Newman there, who used to run Cafe Direct. If it's kind of cool to hang out with fair trade people, if you're a politician or a businessman or a businesswoman, is that them just capturing what you're about and just using it for their own ends? And should we be worried about that, if that's the case? So, summary, finishing now. Certainly in the way it presents itself, fair trade seems to try to combine all that social enterprise stuff with the social movement, social change stuff. And in that sense, maybe it's a good example of kind of trying to capture this whole social entrepreneurship, social enterprise space that has these different dimensions. But these are clearly in tension. Holding together those two objectives isn't easy. And as you get mainstream, and as you get institutionalised, is there always a problem that you're going to get diluted, your mission's going to drift, you might get co-opted or captured by somebody else more powerful? And if that is the case, you know, what does that tell us about social entrepreneurship more generally? You know, if we want to believe that social enterprises and social entrepreneurship are going to help change the world, are going to play a role in all that stuff I showed you at the beginning, you know, business, government, civil society changing in a different dynamic way, well, what happens if they get mainstream? If social enterprises become mainstream, do they stop being social enterprises? Do they have to give up trying to change the world? Do they become the world that they were trying to change? And if they do, what do we think about that?